Hello, Book 2, and welcome back to Epic Wednesdays. This is a world's finest collaboration between myself and Michael K Vaughan. I'll leave a link to his channel down below, in which he is leading us, and I am sort of the Statler and Waldorf up on the balcony, through Marvel's Epic collection line. Their collection of full-color reprint volumes in paperback. He has a million of these things, and I have had almost all of them myself, but I haven't kept them. They're fairly expensive, but I have managed to get rid of them, cycle through quite a bit of them. I only have about a dozen at the moment. And the one that we're dealing with today is not one that I have, but I do have electronic copies of all of these issues. And this is this Great Power, the Epic collection that collects the first run of the Lee Ditko years of The Amazing Spider-Man. So this has, here, let me get you pictures of what this has. This has Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy, with Jack Kirby cover there. The world will know the awesome might of Spider-Man, where he was given a sort of a tryout here until he warranted his own comic book. And then we move on from Amazing Fantasy to Spider-Man #1, guest starring the Fantastic Four. And Michael K Vaughan points out that this comic book changed comics, and I would agree. At one point in his video, I'll leave a link to his video down below, he says at the end of his video that he thinks that the Lee Kirby run on the Fantastic Four, the launching flagship of the new Marvel era of comics, was more influential on all of the subsequent 60, 80 years than any other thing that Marvel, those years of Marvel did. I don't think I agree with that. This particular video is not going to give all of you bloodthirsty little marmosets what you really want, which is for Michael K Vaughan and I to disagree. I largely agree on everything that he said about this run. Here, let me give you the picture of it while I'm talking about it. I largely agree with everything that he said about this run in terms of how great it is, how subversive it is, how genius it is. And I think this probably had a greater impact on what the Marvel brand would be, as we would say in the 21st century, than anything in the Fantastic Four. But one way or another, the elements that cause that brand to be distinctive are the same. In that Amazing Fantasy issue where Spider-Man is introduced, he is introduced as a New York teenager, Peter Parker, who's just going to high school, and is sort of looked down on by the popular kids at school because he's a science nerd. But the thing is, he himself is normal. He's not ancestrally called to be a superhero. He's a normal person who expects, what are we actually told here? To his Uncle Ben, he was a pretty special lad. So a fairly mundane, humdrum beginning to the story, but as you all know the origin story of Spider-Man, because that origin story has been adapted in, what is it now, 20 different medium, a bunch of different movies, all starring 40-year-old men, or a-holes, or 40-year-old men who are a-holes. Teenage Peter Parker goes to a science exhibit and is bitten by a radioactive spider, and thereby gains what is referred to in Amazing Fantasy and in all the earliest issues of Spider-Man as spider powers. So the proportionate strength and speed of a spider, and the ability to cling to walls, and a spider sense. And I ignored Amazing Fantasy at the time, especially since I believed back when it came out that it was just Stan Lee's dig at Superman. Superman is able to move, at this point in continuity, is able to move planets, is able to travel through time just by wishing so. It could do anything. Basically, he could do anything. Unless you had kryptonite, he could do anything. And Spider-Man intentionally seemed like a kind of a beatnik counterculture commentary on Superman. That here's a character who's not able to do all that, who has a very ordinary life and feet of clay. So I ignored Amazing Fantasy, Spider-Man's. I didn't confess, I didn't buy it until issue #1, and only because it had the Fantastic Four in it, not because I was all that interested in this new character. It seemed a little creepy, a little weird. But once I started buying Spider-Man, it didn't take me long to read that Amazing Fantasy. I think another guy had it that I was able to just borrow it and read it. They could retire on it today. And immediately saw the problems. I immediately saw the problems with that origin story. I'm not going to belabor them too much here because unlike Avengers #1, Spider-Man is a success upon launch, conceptually speaking. Michael K. Vaughan points out that the two issues of the Epic Collection, this one and the next one, that contain the Lee Ditko run on Spider-Man. We've talked about runs on comics before, where a writer and an artist are creating something special. Michael K. Vaughan talks about that run as being, up until it frittered away at the end, really epic, really special. I completely agree. Only in this case, it wasn't that the writer and artist were entirely simpatico. I don't think Lee and Ditko much liked each other. But the ideas gelled anyway into a run. And I think the run was conceptually successful right away, right from the beginning. Unlike, for instance, the Avengers. But so I'm not going to quibble about the Spider-Man's origin story quite as much as I did about the Avengers. Although, when I read it for the first time, all those decades ago, I was immediately struck by some problems. Like, for instance, I mean, Stan Lee is big on radiation, right? Everything involves radiation with him. But also coincidence. And radiation, I guess, was on everybody's mind in the early 1960s. But coincidence is just bad storytelling. And Peter Parker's the only high school student who goes to this science exhibit, and he's the only one who's bitten of all the people who are there. And he's the only one who's bitten by a radioactive spider who's also working on web shooters that he can then incorporate into his Spider-Man identity. It seemed a little bit much, and also I had quibbles with the superpowers that Peter Parker gets. He gets super spider powers. Well, I don't know how many spiders any of you have ever met. They're not particularly fast. Okay? They don't have spider speed. They might have proportionate spider strength, but part of it comes from the number of limbs that they have. Peter Parker, except for one brief instant in Spider-Man continuity, never sprouts extra arms. He certainly doesn't get any of Spider's genuinely noticeable attributes. His eyes don't change. He doesn't get supervision, much less extra eyes or extra irises. He doesn't gain the ability to generate webbing. Okay? Except, again, in one of the movie adaptations where the showrunners thought, well, let's just fix this. It's strange credulity to think that this high school student would be able to invent a web shooter that's the envy of all the world. So instead of that, and because it makes more logical sense for him to get this power from the spider bite, let's just have him have that ability to generate webs from his body. Some of you may remember that movie, and how despite the fact that it's logical, it doesn't work at all. Now, I'm not excusing Stan Lee's coincidences here, but it doesn't work at all, no matter how conceptually clean it is, for your male teenage hero to have as one of his superpowers the ability to we won't say ejaculate, let's just say generate huge amounts of sticky, viscous fluid from his body. That is not a superpower that you want to advertise. So it didn't work, and it wasn't held over in other adaptations. But in this original, Peter Parker certainly doesn't gain that ability. And he doesn't gain hairy hands. He gains a magical ability to stick to things, for his fingers to stick to things. Spiders climb seemingly sheer surfaces because they have a finer and finer Matryoshka doll variation in hairs at the edges of their fingers, at the edges of their legs, that allow them to exploit minute cracks in seemingly sheer surfaces. They don't have a mystical ability to stick to things, and Peter Parker does. And most of all, I don't know how you deal with the spiders that you catch inside your homes. Once upon a time, for a long time, I dealt with them by smashing them with whatever book was handy. I don't do that anymore. I haven't done that in a long time. My surly houseboy read me the riot act about it and eventually convinced me that they aren't capable of hurting you in most cases. They certainly don't want to. And if they're wandering around in your house, it's either because they're lost or because they're frightened, and in either case you should relocate them instead of killing them. You don't have to kill them. So nowadays, if I encounter a spider climbing a wall or crossing the floor in my kitchen, I assume the spider lives in the kitchen. and is probably doing me a favor by living in the kitchens, probably living off animals that I don't want in my food. And I tend to shoo it away. If it's on the floor of the kitchen and Frida's anywhere nearby, there's nothing I can do. she will crush it and maybe eat it, but usually just crush it. She's not all that bloodthirsty. Even with the mice that she kills, she's not interested in eating them. It's mainly just they moved without permission, they should be destroyed. But if I encounter a spider in my kitchen, I assume it lives there. And I don't under any circumstances kill it anymore. And if I encounter a spider somewhere else, in the bedroom or in some of the other rooms, I assume that it's lost and just relocate it. My surly houseboy has told me, just put it outside and don't think about it. And I can live with that. But any of you who don't do that, any of you who decide, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, that if a spider wanders into your house, it has signed its own death warrant, you know perfectly well, a spider does not have a spider sense. They don't have a sense that warns them of impending danger, much less intention. Peter Parker's spider sense has to be telepathic in some sense, because it can detect not only nearby danger, spinning buzzsaw or flying knife or something like that, but someone who's planning to spin a buzzsaw or throw a knife. If you put a spider in the middle of a coffee table that's surrounded by humans, it will not be able to tell which human is planning to smush it flat. Spiders just don't have that ability, and Peter Parker does. So he develops a whole suite of superpowers, and does not turn to evil, even though the taunting that he's received at the hands of his schoolmates is enough to make a Marvel supervillain. It doesn't turn Peter Parker into a supervillain, but it does make him, he's just a teenager, he's just a kid. And he wants to sort of figure out what to do with this, maybe become a star. He doesn't, at first, in any way think of being a vigilante superhero. Not at all. Until, famously, again, you're going to know these details because you've seen, if nothing else, you've seen movie productions of this origin story. He lets a criminal run by him, even though the cop who's chasing the criminal urges him to just stop the guy. You don't have to do anything else. I'll do the rest. But Peter Parker says, you know, not my problem, Jack. And the criminal later breaks into Peter Parker's home and kills his virtuous Uncle Ben. And when Peter Parker realizes this, not only does he hunt down the criminal, but he dedicates himself to righting that wrong. And speaks the line that has become such a refrain that talking news anchors on cable news channels recite it without even knowing where it comes from. With great power comes great responsibility. No explanation is given for why Aunt May survives that burglary. Presumably, if Uncle Ben was at home, she was at home. It's Uncle Ben who's shot dead, but not Aunt May. And when Peter Parker hunts down the criminal, he finds him in an abandoned warehouse. And here you get Steve Ditko artwork. Look at that panel. Let me see here. This one here. Look at that. That is the abandoned warehouse. Isn't that awesome? Look at the... you can't really tell because Ditko probably did these incredibly fast. But this is amazing stuff. Composition-wise, this is just amazing stuff. And one way that you'll be able to tell whether or not your comic book reprint has been tampered with, my comic book reprint for these electronic versions has been tampered with, will be a famous panel. The panel when Spider-Man realizes that the criminal that he's just knocked unconscious is the same guy that he could have stopped. My panel has been tampered with because in the original, Ditko puts two little dots in those eye spots to emphasize how stunned Peter Parker is. He puts two little dots there, and they aren't in this reprint. You can always tell when somebody's mucked around with that. Peter Parker decides at that point to fight crime, but he needs help. Apparently, Aunt May and Uncle Ben are renting their cottage in Brooklyn or Queens or whatever it is, because there's a guy asking for the rent no sooner than they put Uncle Ben in the ground, and Aunt May doesn't have a job. So Peter Parker tells her, you know, I need to quit school and get a job. She says, no, I won't hear of it, and she pawns her jewelry. But Peter Parker nevertheless wants to make money. He has to make money. And a point that Michael K. Vaughan made that I want to stress here is how revolutionary that is. That was unheard of. Almost all the stuff that you're reading in these early issues was unheard of. It was Stan Lee doing the best he could to say, what would happen if an ordinary kid gained superpowers? What would happen? That was revolutionary. I think that's a large part of why Spider-Man caught on so much. because suddenly thousands and thousands of people were reading these issues and saying, hey, wait a minute, I have these problems. What would I do if I got spider powers? What would I do? I don't think I'd just devote myself selflessly to fighting crime. I think I'd probably try and find a way to cash in on it. I'm not sure that a lot of those readers would probably not have said, I'll just let a criminal go by. They probably wouldn't have done that. But in the subsequent issues, Spider-Man #1, Peter Parker as Spider-Man goes to the Fantastic Four at their headquarters, the Baxter Building. He goes to the Baxter Building because he assumes the Fantastic Four is a paying gig and that they will hire him because he has these amazing abilities and his money problems will be solved. They don't. They tell him we're a non-profit organization, basically a family. So we don't pay at all. He leaves them. But he still has to come up with a way to make money. And he comes up with a way, which is to attach a camera. When he goes out as Spider-Man, Spider-Man is a news sensation. He is this new costume crime fighter on the scenes. When you go out as Spider-Man, he will take pictures of himself as Spider-Man and sell them to the Daily Bugle, the newspaper who's running editorials against Spider-Man as a masked menace. He'll have the best shots of Spider-Man because he'll know exactly where Spider-Man is going to be because he is Spider-Man. And J. Jonah Jameson, of course, you know again from the movies, is the crusading publisher who refuses to like Spider-Man, but is happy to take Peter Parker's photos and pay him well for them, to the point where Peter Parker can alleviate Aunt May's financial problems. J. Jonah Jameson rose through we learn much later on in a miniseries named Marvels, that J. Jonah Jameson rose through the ranks of the Daily Planet. He didn't buy the thing. He rose through the ranks from a cub reporter. It never seems to cross his mind that the only person who could possibly get these kinds of pictures of Spider-Man would have to be Spider-Man. It never seems to cross his mind, nor does it seem to cross the mind of any of the reporters that are on the Daily Planet staff. Instead, Peter Parker has a regular gig selling photographs of himself to the Daily Bugle and starts to fight crime. He encounters a masked menace named the Chameleon. He encounters a flying criminal named the Vulture. He encounters an electric criminal named Electro who is electrified. He can throw electric bolts. And again, when I was reading these original issues, I had a little bit of a problem with that because this initial run of Spider-Man is another thing that's a little bit strange about it, a little bit different, a thing that you expect nowadays, but that was sort of revolutionary when it happened, is that visit to the Fantastic Four. It is clearly signaled that Spider-Man lives in the same world as the Fantastic Four. And although the Fantastic Four might not notice anything about the Chameleon, they would certainly notice Electro. They would certainly notice the Vulture. And in these early years, they aren't fighting Galactus. They could easily have taken a hand. They don't do it, and there's no explanation given for that. And that is always that is the Achilles heel of the Stan Lee Marvel universe, is that he will create circumstances in one book that seem to be siloed off from all the other books. Even though he seems to love his own intercontinuity, he will still silo things off like that. The quintessential example of this, that again is not introduced until decades later, is not explained until decades later, is how in the world you could have Galactus threaten the Earth without involving everyone. Why wouldn't that involve everyone? Why is it the Fantastic Four who are fighting Galactus and losing in downtown Manhattan when the whole sky of the world is on fire? When Galactus has announced to the whole world his intention to consume the planet, why aren't the Avengers involved? Why isn't Thor involved? Why aren't the Inhumans involved? Etc., etc. Why is it just the Fantastic Four? Stan Lee uses that silo effect when it suits him dramatically, and he ignores it when it doesn't. And so he has Peter Parker just go to the Baxter Building. But he never has the Fantastic Four go to Peter Parker's villains. Okay, that's fine. One way or another, it never seems to cross teenage Peter Parker's mind. He fights, a come-one, come-all wrestling giant in order to earn a quick $100. He'll sell pictures of himself as Spider-Man, even though it runs a strong risk, we have to assume, of outing himself as Spider-Man and causing Aunt May to be extra worried. but it never seems to cross his mind to capitalize on his webbing. Peter Parker invents a web fluid that is so compressible that you can keep it in little canisters so you can mount on your wrist, right? The thwip. but that when upon contact with air, it expands in concentrated form. We are told it is strong enough to restrain the thing. In other words, stronger than steel, stronger than titanium. Steel and titanium bonds of that width, the thing can break. Spider-Man's webbing at that thickness is stronger than those things are. It's mostly fireproof. It can contain the Human Torch. There's so much of it that Spider-Man can make all sorts of shapes out of it. Shields, or parachutes, or bolos, or staffs. In other words, even if Peter Parker had not gained spider strength, spider speed, a spider agility, anything like that, if he'd just been made normal, if the spider had no effect on him whatsoever, his web fluid is still a more potent weapon than Captain America's shield, Daredevil's Billy Club. If Peter Parker had gained nothing, no superpowers by that, he could still have made himself a super being in the Marvel Universe, since no one else has this web fluid. But it never seems to cross his mind to patent the stuff and make a mint off it, when he could. There's no substance like this anywhere else in the world. Not only when Spider-Man first started, but at any point afterwards. That never seems to come to his mind. That's all right, I guess. One way or another, we get a terrific run here. Just Stan Lee coming up with, look at this, the Vulture flying through a subway tunnel. Look at how great that is. I tell you, Ditko could do amazing things. That is just amazing. Michael K. Vaughan mentions this. He filmed his video from rustic Vaughan Lodge because he's having renovations done at Vaughan Manor. Stately Vaughan Manor is having renovations. Whenever he says that, you should probably know a little bit of insider dirt here. All he's doing is enlarging the dungeons at Vaughan Manor. Again, why he needs dungeons that big when their most celebrated occupant, Jimmy Hoffa, is long dead, I don't know. But one way or another, that's what he means. And that's why he's at Vaughan Lodge, which is somewhere in the Pyrenees, I think, where occasionally when Michael Vaughan gets bored, he goes hunting. Oh, but not for ibex or boar. He hunts for the most dangerous game of all. I'll leave that between him and Interpol. But one way or another, he points out that this is a fantastic run. And he's right. And it's also revolutionary, and I believe more revolutionary than the Fantastic Four. I think Spider-Man set the mold of a totally fallible hero who is still trying to do the right thing, but who has bills to pay. And that stays true about Peter Parker for a long time. The character undergoes enormous amounts of change over the decades. But one thing that stays true is that he has bills to pay. And gets, as time goes on, crappy apartments and whatnot. Stan Lee never tired in backup features of writing about web fluid and what a miracle it was. When Tony Stark has not invented it, Hank Pym has not invented it, there's no great scientists who have invented it, it's just Peter Parker. This ordinary boy, this science geek, who's done that, who's invented this stuff. This is a fantastic run, and it put Spider-Man on the map. I think it put Marvel Comics on the map, and Spider-Man, the comic, has continued throughout the remaining 60 years to draw fantastic artwork. Fantastic talent has been drawn to this title. I think because there's a great rogues gallery. Michael K. Vaughan mentions how great Spider-Man's rogues gallery is. I feel sorry for modern Spider-Man fans, in specifically from the 90s until now, who, if you go by Spider-Man comics, as far as they're concerned, Spider-Man only has one villain, and that's Venom. I feel sorry that they don't know how great this rogues gallery was, but it was terrific. The Vulture, Dr. Octopus, the Sandman, Kraven the Hunter, the Chameleon, all sorts of weird and outre characters. Spider-Man not only fought them all and figured out ways to beat them, but Stan Lee also had the great idea of teaming them all up to fight Spider-Man at the same time. This marginally superpowered teenage boy from suburban New York. It's a fantastic run, and it continued to attract great talents to it. Michael K. Vaughan in his video mentions John Romita Sr., also John Romita Sr.'s son, John Romita Jr., also a great Spider-Man artist. Ross Andrew, who we mentioned last time, I think is one of the great Spider-Man artists. We'll be getting to him. I don't know if there's an Epic collection about him, but there will be. There absolutely will be. And a bunch of others who've done great work. Ron Frenz, not very well heralded as a writer, but I think he does great Spider-Man work. One way or another, that's our Epic collection for today, is the dawn of Spider-Man. The only issues, the only comments that Michael K. Vaughan made in his videos, which I would probably disagree just a bit, and it's not a serious disagreement like when he hauls on Herb Trimpe for the Hulk. It's not a serious disagreement. Instead, it's a point of discussion between friends. He makes one claim, which is that he thinks the Fantastic Four is the one that really renovated the new age of comics. When I think it was this that did it. I think it was this run that did it, for Spider-Man. And another claim that he makes in his video is that he thinks that Ditko's work on Doctor Strange was even better than his work on this run of Spider-Man, and I don't tend to agree with that. I think, for visual iconography, I think this run on Spider-Man beats everything that Ditko did for Marvel. But one way or another, it's a fantastic run. I can't recommend it strongly enough. The only thing I would caution you about is make sure that your run has those dots in the eyes in Amazing Fantasy. They need to be there. If Steve Ditko decides as an artist that those two dots in the eyes of Spider-Man need to be there, the only way you get to decide if to airbrush them out is if you're a better artist than Steve Ditko. And there are about 4 people who can make that decision, and none of them would have. So if you buy a reprint volume, that origin story of Spider-Man has been reprinted a million times. If it doesn't have those dots, put them in there. Just take a pen and put them in there. I can't on this electronic version, or I would. But we're going to wrap this up. I strongly recommend this volume and the next one. Great Power and Great Responsibility are the 2 Epic collections that encompass the whole Lee Ditko run on Spider-Man. And it really is a formative run. It's an amazing thing. So I strongly encourage it. And according to Michael K. Vaughan, we'll be getting to an even more epic run on Spider-Man, also written by Stan Lee, but drawn by John Romita. We'll be getting to that. Oh my, oh my, oh my! As much as I love Ditko's run on Spider-Man, John Romita Sr., oh my, oh my, an order of magnitude better. But apparently that's not the next one we'll be doing. The next one will be the Fantastic Four, and you can count on a lot of commentary there, including a lot of commentary from me about movie adaptations of the Fantastic Four. A vexed property in Hollywood history. We'll be talking a lot about that, I'm sure. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up. That was your Comic Book Wednesday. I have been absolutely, in the last 12 hours, deluged with ninja writing work. Just leaping out of nowhere. So I'm not sure that I'll be making any of the videos today, but I'll make a barrage of them tomorrow because I have to get all this stuff done today. I swear, editors, such needy creatures like kittens. But one way or another, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.